本集节目由永丰金控冠名赞助，翻转金融，共创美好生活，以新闻开启国际视野。永丰金控与您一同掌握全球脉动。大家好，欢迎收听联合开炮，我是郭崇伦。我们今天访问的是米德教授 Rana Mitter。我第一次见到他是在2014年国史馆召开的抗战史研讨会的时候，当时他才刚刚出版了《被遗忘的盟友》这个书，特别强调中国对于第二次世界大战的角色跟贡献，受到两岸学界的推崇。他当时才是新锐的学者，他没有想到会有这么多的台湾或者是大陆的读者会对于一本外国学者写的书产生这么大的兴趣。今年是二次大战结束的80周年，他又来到台湾参加长风基金会所举办的专门的一个演讲会。但是米德教授已经转换跑道，从牛津大学做历史研究，被挖到哈佛大学甘迺迪学院，转而现在专注在当代的政策方面的研究。我对他的访问是从先问他历史的意义，尤其是两岸对于抗战不同的诠释开始，这是上部分，下一半就谈到他对当代中国的分析。Thank you, Professor Mitter, for taking your time and talk with us. To begin with, I would like to start with we have a similar kind of interview in 2014 when you visit Taiwan. At the time, it was hosted by it was the Ma Ying-jeou administration, and they were having a grand celebration about the anti-Japanese war anniversary. And your book, especially The Forgotten Ally, have been widely received both in Taiwan and in China. I want to ask you, how come, are you surprised by both China and Taiwan is highly regarding about your work? And what, are you kind of expecting that, or the theme of your book, how is that corresponding to the view that is happening in Taiwan and China?
Well, thank you for that question. I would say that I was not expecting it at all. It was a great surprise to me and a great pleasure that so many readers, both in Taiwan and in the mainland of China, did find something valuable in that book, which, as you pointed out, was first published in Chinese about 11 years ago and in English first in 12 years ago. So it's a little while now. I wrote the book really much more because of a personal sense, which I still have, that it's important for the English-speaking world to have some sort of comprehensive understanding of the Chinese war experience during World War II. I probably said to you then, I'll say again now, because I still think it's true, maybe it's a little sad that it's true still 12 years later, that the Chinese theater of World War II is the one that's least well understood in the Western world. I think it's better understood, not just because of my book, but other books such as Cambridge professor Hans van der Ven's book, China at War, which has been published since. There are some other ones too, that there's now more knowledge about that aspect of the war, but it's still, compared to the number of books on the Pacific War, on the North African campaign, even the Soviet Union's war, the books on China's war in English are quite small in number. In Chinese, of course, both in the mainland and in Taiwan, there are very many, wonderful books on different aspects, both of the specialist research and more general studies. But yes, at the same time, I think it's fair to say that my interest in writing the book was to say something that I thought was important. But I intended the book, of course, it was written in English, for Western readers. And so I was delighted to hear that anyone either in Taiwan or China would be interested in knowing what a foreign academic had to say about this war. I guess to some extent, actually, it would be interesting for British readers to know what China thinks about Britain's war effort too, so it could go both ways. And there are some authors, I think, who have looked at aspects of that. For instance, recently, just in the last year, some scholars in Hong Kong, including some young scholars, have been working on the only Chinese officer who served at Normandy on D-Day. But these sorts of stories still are not very common. So for the most part, I was surprised and very delighted that readers here in Taiwan and in China and in Asia had any interest in my book. I'm glad to hear that.
That's the common aspect of it, both China and Taiwan. But there's also different aspect, especially on the narrative of the length of the war against Japan.
Yeah.
In Taiwan, generally it's followed the nationalist government's narrative, meaning that it start counting from the Marco Polo incident.
八年抗战.
八年抗战. But in terms of Chinese, the CCP had begun a new narrative, which started from the 1931 Macaudian incidents.
Yeah.
And that counts 14 years.
Yeah.
14年抗战.
14年抗战.
Right, right. Why is there's that kind of difference? Is it the way that the CCP want to emphasize how important it had been leading this resistance against the Japanese?
I think there are actually different motivations. So I think that, first of all, we have to say something about the history of this change. Until about maybe about 10 years ago, there were scholars in the mainland of China who debated this question.
Okay.
And some people, emphasized the 8-year war of resistance, and other people emphasized the 14-year war of resistance. And within that, there were also specific interpretations to try and get over this question, try and reduce the contradictions. So people in some kind of, particularly the specialists on the history in the mainland, would say that 9/18, the Manchurian incident, was the beginning of the 片面抗战, so the kind of partial war of resistance. And then Lugoqiao, the Marco Polo Bridge, is the beginning of the 全面抗战. But then I think in 2017, the official statement was made that this was going to be 14 years, but you could divide it in this way. And then more recently, in the last couple of years, I think, actually it's moved to saying that even 片面, 全面, doesn't matter, it's just one 抗战. So it's kept changing. So there are some scholars who have looked in detail at the question of why it's changed. So I'll name one. Professor Emily Matson of Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. has looked at this question of what she calls the date debate on the dates there. I would say, though, that her research and other people's research shows that actually it's not just about the CCP. It's relevant, but actually also the influence of scholars from northeast China, from Dongbei. Because if you start the war, the real war in 1937, 八年抗战, then that whole earlier period of the invasion and occupation and formation of the Manchukuo state doesn't count. It's just something before. And I think that a lot of Northeastern scholars and Northeastern politicians wanted to make sure that Dongbei's experience was included in that wider sense of Kangjian. So that's another separate reason. I will say, because you might ask me, do I agree with this change? So I can answer for you that question. I would still say that for the war itself, I would go with the 8-year war of resistance. This is why. First of all, for those of us working on the war in Asia as historians, we still have to push back a bit against our European colleagues who say, no, the Second World War began in 1939 when Hitler invaded Poland, because that's saying that anything before that is not really the World War, and then the World War starts in Europe, and then Pearl Harbor is when Asia comes together. But I would say that still doesn't fully work, because unless the war started in Asia at some point, then you can't have the Japanese entering the war in 1941. The Chinese side must be important. But I think that between 1931 and 37, if you look at the historical materials, Chinese people themselves, outside Dongbei in particular, don't consider themselves to be at war. In 1933, there's actually a truce, the Tanggu Xie. And then in 1934, you have, what's the name, He Yingqin and...
和美协定.
Exactly, they say. So these sorts of things are a sign that there's some kind of compromise possible, even though Weimanzhuo is never recognized by Jiang Jieshi. But actually, some continuities eventually happened. Railways going back and forth, postal services, you could send letters. So that's not the same as a war situation. After 1937-38, then it turns into a full-scale war. And I think that 1937 is different. So I think that previous system of talking maybe about Qianmian, if you need to, is more helpful rather than saying it's just all one period. But I have to say, in the end, it's a political description.
Right.
It's not really what historians would say.
Right. You have to forgive me to hang on the first half of the interview on the historical narrative, because
of course.
This year is the 80th anniversary of the end of the war.
Certainly.
So a lot of the focus is on this. But my question next would be, there's a third interpretation of the war, especially it's coming from a so-called Taiwan identity.
Yes.
Taiwan subjectivity. That is the narrative the current Taiwan government, the DPP government, is developing. How do you see this kind of narrative? And then how can we put some historical meaning in this kind of interpretation?
So I would say that historical interpretation and political uses of history are two separate things. And actually, they're both legitimate as long as they draw on an accurate historical base. To explain what I mean by that. Politicians in all countries around the world draw on the history of many events, but certainly World War II, let's stick to World War II, that's our subject today, to make a point about the present day. So, we've just in Britain, where I just came from, had the same commemorations, and much of the commemoration is about Britain as a country in Europe that preserved democracy and freedom when Europe is invaded by the Nazis. That's quite legitimate as an interpretation. Also, if we think about the interpretations that have been here in Taiwan over not 1 or 2 years, but 50 or 70 years, the previous Kuomintang governments before democracy also stressed the wartime period. But one of the things that they really wanted to do was to remove the CCP completely from the story.
Yes.
And the CCP did the same thing on the other side of the Taiwan Straits. Nowadays, I think it's fair to say that, even later, 10 years ago when Ma Ying-jeou was president, that they didn't seek to exclude the CCP. The KMT story of the war had begun to include the CCP. Why could I say that? Because there was a big conference here in Taipei, I think that's where we met last time, and plenty of scholars from the Chinese mainland came at that time. So obviously they would share the mainland perspective, but it was compatible with the two. And in the same way, even today, there are plenty of people in the mainland who are still researching the Kuomintang history, although today, maybe there's less stress on that story than 10 years ago. So today, if contemporary leaders on either side want to draw some particular lesson from World War II, I think it's natural that they will stress things that fit their own particular model of the world. But you might ask, so let me answer before you ask, but aren't there any occasions when there is an illegitimate use of World War II? And I say that actually there's one very obvious one today, which is the way in which Russia has been talking about World War II as a justification for its invading Ukraine. That clearly is not, I think, an accurate portrayal of the historical background of World War II. But I think that's a different thing from people choosing which aspects of the history suit their politics better.
As you know, just a few days ago, Xi Jinping, Chinese president, had attended the 80th anniversary held in Moscow, the Grand Parade. And I'd like you to examine this history, especially the alliance between China and Russia. During the anti-Japanese war, I believe the Soviet Union is the first country to come to aid with China. And now we are seeing Xi Jinping and Putin is having a back-to-back alliance against the West. What kind of historical implication can we draw from it? Is it just a coincidence after 80 years from now, or is it something more deeper than that?
So I think there are several things in your very interesting question that we have to separate. First of all, in some ways, the commemoration of the war by China, by going to Moscow, is ironic. Because yes, you're right that for the first few months, well, year or so, of the war in China, 1937 to 38, there was considerable unofficial assistance given by Soviet Air Force pilots to defending the skies over Shanghai and eastern China. So many people, even today, perhaps in the West, have heard of the famous, the Feihudui, the Flying Tigers, but they don't know that the Soviets actually were there before. So that's accurate, should be remembered. Of course, shortly afterwards, by about 1940, Stalin withdrew that assistance and was neutral against Japan for the whole war until the very last weeks in August 1945.
Right.
So of all the allies, the Soviet Union was doing the least compared to America or Britain for China. But that, I think, is not mentioned very much in the commemorations in Moscow. So in terms of history, that's one point that I think historians would put differently from politicians. In terms of what it means for the alliance, I think China's position actually is a bit more complex. Certainly by going to Moscow and spending, I think, 3 days, actually, between Putin and Xi, I think Xi was making it clear, also Putin, that any rumors in the Western world that maybe it's possible to separate China and Russia will not come off. We may talk later about what some people are calling the reverse Nixon strategy. But, okay. Yeah. But at the same time, China is also still being quite cautious in some ways. It's never officially given support to Russia. When asked, and I've asked Chinese policymakers about this, they will say, we recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine like any other sovereign country.
And it's based on traditional CCP policy that we will never form an alliance with the other countries, right?
Yes. Mainly because the only one they formally have is with North Korea, and they consider that to be so mafan that having any other sorts of alliances would be very difficult from their point of view. But I think having partnerships, I think that's the way that you might say that. Or is it the 无上限的友谊 was the phrase previously. It's interesting, that phrase, partnership with no upper limit. People talk about unlimited friendship, but actually, the no upper limit is really, I think, the key thing. They're not using that phrase, the Chinese, so much anymore. It's much less common now than it was 2 years ago.
After the deputy minister had been sacked because of this.
You're the journalist who has the inside knowledge. I couldn't tell you about that, but I can say that certainly looking at the language, it's changed. And so I think that's a sign that while there is no way I can see that Xi Jinping will abandon Putin, and he wants to make it clear that they have a strong partnership, he doesn't want to completely be united with Russia on everything, because I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect that many people in China were actually leaders were quite surprised by this very rash action by Russia in invading Ukraine. And when they failed, because remember the original plan was 3 days, Ukraine would fall. It's 3 years, it still hasn't fallen. Okay, they've occupied some parts, but Zelensky is still there. I think many decision makers in China would look at that and think, was Putin's actions so wise? So they'll never say that in public, but behind the scenes, I think maybe that friendship you saw in Red Square is still more cautious.
I'd like to continue with part of your answer. It means that we have a new American president. President Trump is now...
A new old president, because he was there before.
Right. He tried to end the war in Ukraine. And most important of all, he wants to restore or have a restart with its relations with Russia. And some people are saying that it's a grand strategy of reverse Nixon that is behind it. Do you agree with this interpretation? I saw one of your piece. You seem do not agree with that. But what's your counter argument on this?
Yeah. So just to explain briefly exactly this idea of, some people call it reverse Nixon, others call it reverse Kissinger, but it's the same idea, that you separate the two powers and bring one close to the United States. And I think amongst others, it's not a secret. Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, I think has been in media saying that if there is an opportunity for the United States to bring Russia further away from China, that's a good thing. So if they manage it, I would be quite impressed, but I don't think it's very likely.
By the way, is it true that in Trump's first term, this was the advice that Kissinger himself had given to President Trump?
Ooh.
Is that that's
really...
the rumor we are hearing, that they were quite close when President Trump first get in office?
I had not heard this rumor, but was it given by any named source?
No.
Okay. No, I mean, I'd be great. Sadly, Henry Kissinger is no longer there, so we can't ask him.
Right.
Maybe other people would know. But
sorry for the interruption.
No, it's great. I'd love to. Maybe I'll have to find out now. But in terms of what's happening now, I think that the major issue is this. The reason that China was willing to talk to Kissinger and then Nixon and essentially moved towards becoming close to the US was that it was in a really dangerous relationship with the Soviet Union. China and the Soviet Union had split by 1960, and 7, 8, 9 years later, they were almost at danger of going to war. I mean, the Zhenbao incident, in 1969, exactly, the Zhenbao in 1969, nearly led to genuine war between the two sides, missiles fighting. So the situation was very dangerous for Mao and China, which they knew. Lin Biao, I think, also was, as defense minister, was worried. And the knowledge that America also had a real problem with the Vietnam War, it wanted to end its Asian commitments, meant that there was shared interest there. But I don't think the same situation applies today. Today, China and Russia, they do have some differences. As I said, I don't think it's a perfect friendship. But they're not at war with each other. They get on well. There are lots of connections, geographical, the border is still there, on fossil fuels, buying oil and other supplies. China, most people think unofficially is giving technology. They're not giving weapons to Russia, but they are providing technology that can help with weapons. So all of these sorts of things, I think, mean that right now, China is not in a dangerous situation where it feels that, China feels that it has a close relationship with Russia, which it's, been supporting. And Russia currently, I think, doesn't see any reason why it would want to separate from China. If the US gets closer, if there's more agreement between President Trump and President Putin, then, Moscow would be very happy. But I don't think they would see that as a reason to become separated from China, because Russia would want both. If it's close to America and Beijing, that's even better for Russia.
Right. Can we say that Russia is enjoying its position in the middle, that both China and the United States want to get Russia's favor, and that is the most perfect position, just like China had been in the 90s.
Yeah. I think that essentially that if it works out that way, then that would be an ideal position from Putin's point of view. From the China side, even when Russia is doing some things that I think, as I said, I think China doesn't necessarily like. For instance, I don't think China wanted Russia to invade Ukraine, but now they have to sort of find ways to deal with them because they don't want to contradict them in public. So that's a win for Russia. They can do things that China doesn't like. But on the American side, we're speaking now in the middle of May. The news headlines day by day, hour by hour, suggest that right now maybe Trump is not so happy with Putin. He's beginning to suspect that maybe Putin isn't going to come to a good deal. So if that deal went wrong, then Russia might lose America again. As we're speaking, we don't know which way that's going to go.
Right. Okay. That's mostly the historical question I have. On the later half, I'd like to ask you, as a policy expert, you have moved from Great Britain to the United States. Now you are residing at Harvard Kennedy School. And it's quite different from being a historian into a policy expert that is focusing more on current affairs. So is there any different between the two roles, or is it you are seeing things from a historical perspective that can see something that other experts cannot see?
Well, I would hesitate to say that I have any unique insights. Most of what I want to teach the students gathers from experts from a whole variety of areas. But I will say that so far in the couple of years that I've been teaching at the Kennedy School, I have been keen to teach. I've been teaching a course that does stress that history is an important lens for understanding contemporary China. And actually the course that we offer, or that I offer, about China's place in the world, past and present, takes a different theme every week. And each week we look at one issue through a historical lens, and the same issue through a contemporary lens. So for instance, we mentioned Nixon before. So, on first day, we might look at the Nixon visit from 50 years ago, assess that. And then, the next day, we'll come back and talk about how the US Secretary of State, say Antony Blinken, has visited China, what the similarities are. Or, in the first session, we might look at 9/18, the invasion of Manchuria. And then the next day, we look at the invasion of Ukraine and how China has reacted to that as well. So looking at China's contemporary reactions on trade, international security, science, globalization, looking at all of these through a historical lens, I think does give depth. And it's been a great pleasure teaching public policy students that, of course, they must know about the present day. Of course, they should learn how to think rationally about the future. But to do these, they really should know more about the past.
In the recent article you published in Foreign Affairs, you are predicting, you go furthermore.
It's the most dangerous thing for any historian to do, to predict the future.
For what happened in 20 years from now.
I know. It's crazy, but we met 10 years ago, so you have me back in 20 years and tell me if I was right.
Okay. One of the things you said is that you think that Xi Jinping will still have influence over China, just like Deng Xiaoping had been in his year 92 years old.
Yeah.
Right. And this is kind of ominous sign for Taiwan, because everyone is saying that one of the main legacy for Xi Jinping to keep in his position is that he wants to so-called reunited Taiwan with China. That is his mission. And you're saying?
So if I may, I hope the message I will get over, perhaps I should have written even more clearly, but I encourage readers to go to it and see, is that that's not quite the message that I wanted to put over. So first of all, on Xi Jinping, I said that he might, still have power in his 90s like Deng Xiaoping, because a lot of Chinese leaders live a long time. We don't know. But even if he does, I pointed out that most of the other people by that stage who are leading China will be from a much later generation. So in other words, Xi Jinping now is currently the leader of his cohort, that generation of people who came of age in the Cultural Revolution. But actually the next generations after that, the people who grew up in the 1980s and 90s, actually grew up with a view of China not as, in the Cultural Revolution, turmoil, chaos, terror, but rather of a country that was opening up to the outside world and finding possibilities there. So actually what I'm saying is that those people will be more dominant in 20 years' time. I also say that it seems to me that in a whole variety of areas, technology, science, green energy amongst them, maybe even ideology, in the next 20 years, China may find a lot of opportunities to actually make its case in the world, particularly in the global south. But I do also say that I think the one thing that is likely to really spoil those plans for China is an attempt for any violent takeover of Taiwan. I think actually that will be the least successful thing from China's point of view. So, there's a different question we could discuss about whether it's possible to have a violent assault on Taiwan that would be successful. Many strategists say actually it's very hard to do, and that's not China's best strategy. But even if they did, and even if it was successful, I think the reputational damage that it would do to China over time would be really, the end of its attempt to try and create the idea of China as a big new power in the world that's setting up a new world order. So I actually think that that looks quite optimistic for Taiwan, if that's true, rather than being ominous.
But I like to push that question
Please.
a little bit further,
Of
because
course.
just like Deng Xiaoping, maybe Xi Jinping is having the power, it's kind of veto power. Because in the case of Deng Xiaoping, when the reform momentum had been still, he launched a Nanxun, going to the Shenzhen, and asking, if you do not want to reform, you have to step down. So that had restarted this kind of reform momentum going on. So is Xi Jinping is going to hold that veto power just like Deng Xiaoping, especially if that veto power can be applied in the Taiwan issues?
But I think that actually what that story about Deng Xiaoping shows is actually a different place that is more important for Xi Jinping not to use his veto power, but his enabling power. So let me explain what I mean. If you think about the detail, which you know very well, of course, about what that Nanxun in 1992 was about, 3 years before you have Liu Si, the Tiananmen Square killings. And after that, the more conservative economic members of the CCP, Chen Yun and others, say to Deng Xiaoping, we were right, and Zhao Ziyang was wrong, and he's kicked out, and Hu Yaobang, died before, but he was wrong. And remember that there's a wonderful new book by Robert Suitinger called Conscience of the Party about Hu Yaobang, which says how much leaders, including Deng Xiaoping, really turned on him. So at that point, Chen Yun and the conservatives, Deng Liqun, I think, as well, are saying, actually, your economic policies are wrong. And in that particular case, Deng Xiaoping was not quite on the backbench, but he was certainly at a disadvantage. He wasn't quite sure if he was going to win out. And he had to use, I don't think it was so much his veto power. I think it was more bringing together his reputation. Finally, as the survivor of the Long March, he's the last of, Mao's great comrades, the last of the old generation. One last time he would go to Shenzhen, ride the golf buggy, and show that the economy should open up. Okay, so where's the comparison with Xi Jinping? So right now, we all know, everyone in China knows, that the big central problem is that the economy is not doing well. So many people say what needs to happen is that China needs to unleash entrepreneurial power. It needs to really, it's doing great on some types of technology, green tech, energy, 5G, AI, lots of AI. But where are the jobs? Where are the actual opportunities that come from this? Now, one person can really open up the private sector, the market, maybe even in a very daring move, a real Deng Xiaoping move, opening up capital accounts and making China's currency convertible. These are the really daring things. They have nothing to do with Taiwan. But only a few people can really be in a position to make that change happen. So that kind of enabling power is something that Xi Jinping has, if he chooses to use it. That opening up to the market sector would be the real kind of Nanxun, I think, in that sense. I don't think Taiwan questions actually fall into that category.
Okay. There's another prediction you have for 20 years from now. You said that China is possible to coexist with the West in a manner that is mutually acceptable. Okay. But my question is that provided, regardless what kind of changes China may have, as long as China economies keep growing, do you think that other powers, especially the United States, would try to suppress it and prevent it from happening? This is the typical Thucydides trap, as people have mentioned. Do you agree with that?
So, again, you kindly mentioned the foreign affairs piece I wrote, and I think I'd summarize briefly my answer to the question that you've asked there in the following way. If China chooses to stress its military power and its capacity to coerce through force, the United States and other, what one might call it, sort of allied countries, Japan perhaps, will find it much easier to tell the rest of the world that actually China is a dangerous actor. If China takes steps to withdraw the idea that actually it has huge military power, it's prepared to use it, and stresses its geo-economic power, which is immense, I think that would be a much harder argument for the Western world to make. I'm not saying it's wrong. I would say it's harder. Because if you are in a position where you go around the world saying, actually, China's economic power could be very problematic for the rest of the world, and you're going to sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, and they're saying, we want Chinese solar panels, we want Chinese wind turbines, we want to have 5G. We know Huawei is already in lots of countries' systems. At the moment, I think that it's the threat that China might use its military power that makes many more countries nervous about China and keener to try and be part of a US strategy to push back. So I think the challenge for China, and it's a real challenge, it's very difficult, is whether or not they can actually create a sense of trust around the world about themselves as a geoeconomic actor. If the world continues to move towards an environment where there are separate trading blocks rather than necessarily the kind of free trade world that we had for a long time, that will also affect that decision, I think.
That's the question I want to follow up, is because now we have Donald Trump, which is changing that kind of free trade world into a more neo-mercantilist world that we are seeing, that every country is for itself. There's no collective goods, that we are seeing NATO have gradually, I wouldn't say falling apart, but it's disintegrating. It's not like before. And when China is seeing this, isn't it that it will go back to its original idea, as you have said it in the article, that we need to 先富国 and 强兵, instead of that 强兵would jeopardize its purpose of 富国?
I don't think so, for the following two reasons. First is that it's true that right now, I mean, May 2025, and I'm saying that because in the world of the new world order, which Donald Trump is bringing into being, but which is not just controlled by him, sometimes what happens, 1 month or even 1 day later can be different. So May 2025. First of all, I think that NATO may find that it has more of a role than seems to be the case even 2 or 3 months ago if the Russian discussions on Ukraine don't come to anything. So right now, literally, we don't know what's going to happen in Istanbul. But I would be unsurprised, for instance, and again, I don't know the people involved, but just looking at, as an analyst, look at Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's become more powerful in the last week or two. He's just become the National Security Advisor as well. Nobody since our friend we mentioned, Henry Kissinger, has done both jobs in like 50 years. He has, of course, become a very central part of the new administration by obviously following its policy, but he's also shaping its policy too. And I think that from what you can see, there is no sense that someone like Marco Rubio would want NATO to dissolve, I think, to use your word. I'm sure he'd want other NATO members to pay more money. And he can also, I think, use, strong language to, force other NATO members in certain directions. But I think it's unlikely that someone like that would want NATO to collapse. So we'll see what happens. But I think that NATO may not be so much on the deathbed as some people think. Okay, in terms of trade, you've said that it's turning into a neo-mercantilist world. I don't think so. Right now, the trends that we see is that first of all, the United States, having created briefly a world in which there were huge tariffs on everyone, has now had to pull back quite strongly, not least because the bond markets reacted in ways that made it clear that they would not tolerate a long-term policy of that sort. But actually, it also stimulated another response, which I think will continue, which is that all the other major economies and minor economies in the world that are not the United States and not China will get together and say the two biggest trading partners in the world are not predictable at the moment, and therefore we need to be closer. So I can see the EU, Australia, Canada, which of course is currently, rethinking its relationship with the US in various ways, the UK, maybe countries in ASEAN, all deciding that actually they need to form some sort of more united front. The difference is that China, I think, for a while thought that maybe if these countries were alienated from the United States, then they would join with China. But the problem is that China doesn't have a high enough trust level that many of those countries would just go with China with no other choices. Some other countries also have less of a choice too, in that Canada is right next to the United States. It can't really completely decouple itself. But it's in a position where the US is not the only actor on the table. And I think the Europeans in particular are very interested in finding opportunities to reshape a new global order, which may not be as global as when the US and China were fully integrated into it, but which can cope with a world in which those two actors are more isolationist, if the rest of the world still has an interest in more shared trade.
So you think that Europe will take the lead?
I think that Europe...
I mean, in this world, it's very hard for an order can be formed without a leading power, right?
Yeah. I think that the EU is probably the only trading entity at the moment that has sufficient size and also, more important, sufficient control over the norms of global trade to have a go. I mean, there's an old joke that says that America innovates, China imitates, and Brussels regulates. Now, in each case, that's not entirely accurate, but the central point is a very good one. There are really only a small number of places in the world that have the capacity to set norms and standards. The US, of course, is one. China also has a lot of control, at least over its own sphere with technology and other areas where it sets standards. But the EU actually is still a very powerful actor when it comes to international norms. And if it chooses to use that power more strongly, then it may find itself in a better position in terms of creating those alliances. The complexity comes, and nobody yet knows how this works because it's still in formation now, in a world where the EU and its traditional partners are taking paths that are related but not identical when it comes to both security and trade. But I would say that, NATO being one example, but I would say that there's a lot of interest also in making sure that major economies in Asia, which still, of course, have a tremendous area of global impact. I mean, even now, the third or fourth biggest economy in the world is Japan. And that is not a country that wants to go mercantilist or isolate itself. One other example you'll have seen, within the last 2 weeks, 2 countries that nobody, including me, ever thought would sign an agreement have just done so, UK and India, on trade. India, up to now, has not been a country that has been keen to do trade deals. But the deal with the UK, I think, shows that there is the capability and interest there in India becoming much more of a global arbiter on trade, not today, not tomorrow morning, but over time. I think if you come back in 3 months' time, then there might not still be a huge amount of difference, but you can see how things are moving. If you come back in 3 years' time, at the end of the current presidential term, I think there's a high likelihood that some of the architecture of global trade will have changed quite significantly.
Final question. What kind of advice or suggestion you will give for Taiwan? What I mean is that we are facing a tremendous threat coming from China. And now we are finding our traditional ally, the United States, is no longer trustworthy in a sense. And in Taiwan, we have something every country is asking for, the TSMC, the chips industry. So what kind of choices we have? What can we do in this turbulent world?
I would say that it's very important to keep a lot of channels open and be in communication both at home and abroad. So first thing I should say that first actually, is that it's not for a foreign academic, I think, to give advice to Taiwan, which is a lively and mature democracy and lots of people who debate these issues themselves. But since you graciously asked me, I'll give my humble suggestions. Don't mean to take them. So it's very important that Taiwan has a sense of shared consensus around some important issues. So number one is domestic. There are some signs, it's not as bad as some places, but some signs that the domestic politics of Taiwan is becoming more polarized in a way that's also true in the United States, Germany, quite a lot of liberal democracies. Now, it's still very much a lively democracy with free media like this, and civil society, universities and so forth, very free. Freest in Asia, really. But that must be preserved. And that means that even when people have political differences, finding ways to understand where there is a shared set of values. And those come, I think, from Taiwan's immensely successful conversion of itself in a relatively short period from the 1970s, when it was really a dictatorship under Jiang Jieshi and then, mainly under Chiang Kai-shek. And you had all those movements like the Meilidao magazine and so forth, which, meant that there were real painful and violent struggles that brought about real democratization. Real democratization is not easy to do, and Taiwan should value it and hold on to it because it's central to its values. And then secondly, I would say that whoever is in government, and this could be true for any of the 3 or 4 parties, maybe parties we don't know about yet that might, have power in the legislative yuan or, the presidential level, whoever it might be, that first of all, don't lose faith. Your question seemed to suggest losing faith in the United States. I wouldn't do that. There are a lot of people, and some of them make themselves quite, prominent in the US administration at the moment, who do believe that protection of Taiwan status is a really important part of the wider US portfolio. And I would notice, he wasn't in Taiwan, but I would point out that when Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth visited Asia just a few weeks ago, he made the point of going to Tokyo and Manila and making it clear how important he feels Asian allies are to the United States, in a way that they haven't done for the European allies. So, there is a contrast there. So I'd say don't count the United States out by any means, but keep, very much in dialogue with them. I think that's a very important part of the mix. And the second thing, which is tougher, but I think is really important, which is this. The best way to make it clear to China that Taiwan has its own ways of doing things and thinks about what it's doing is to be in dialogue with them. Now, this isn't always easy because China doesn't always want to talk to people in Taiwan. But actually, one of the things that I think has been one of the biggest problems is that people in the mainland, many of whom deal with, the Taiwan question, as they put it, Taiwan Wenti, don't actually know or understand Taiwan particularly well. They have all the information and the intelligence, but the kind of feeling of understanding a society from the inside is hard for them to do, mainly because, it is hard, I think, for an authoritarian state to understand a democratic state in that way. It's also hard, by the way, for people in democratic states to understand authoritarian states as well. It goes both ways. So finding ways, maybe through academic life, maybe through exchanges, whatever it might be, that both sides get at least to have some sort of dialogue, I think would be useful to do. It's easier to say than do, but I think there are relatively few situations where it is, rather, in most situations, I think it's preferable for people to be having some sort of talks than not having any talks. If the talks are about the wrong thing, then that can be a problem, but generally more dialogue is better than less dialogue.
Thank you very much, Professor Mitter, for taking the time and sharing your insight.
Thanks very much indeed, Julie. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
上网搜寻 VIP.U.com 到联合报数位版，看更多精彩的报道。